looks like it.
Yeah, Jackson. Will I see? Sorry, will I see that? Welcome to the next installment of Interconnected, Reporting the Climate Crisis. We thank all of you who've made it here to DC today, and we thank everyone who's joining us online around the world for this panel that we're calling Modeling Connected Coastlines, Bringing Stories Home. My name's Steve Sapienza. I'm the senior strategist at the Pulitzer Center. I work with the editorial team, and I also manage the Connected Coastlines reporting initiative. My heartfelt thanks to the many Connected Coastlines grantees who are here in attendance here, sharing their journalism, their knowledge, and their experiences in community with this ever-growing and impressive group of journalists from around the world, and educators, I should say. This panel is intended to highlight the reporting and education projects that we've supported as part of our Connected Coastlines initiative, as well as our ongoing local news initiative we call Bringing Stories Home. Now, we've been seeing a lot of really great examples of climate reporting from all over the world, with a lot of emphasis on the importance of representing local perspectives and communities in that reporting. And that is really at the heart and soul of our Connected Coastlines initiative, what we aspire to do when we support the journalists and the newsrooms to do these projects. And we've so far, we started back in 2019 with generous support from the Howard Hughes Department of Science Education. We've been able to support journalists who've generated over 150 local climate news reporting projects all across the U.S. And these are all types of stories. They're print, they're digital, they're documentary films, podcasts. It's just been incredibly impressive to see the diversity, not just of the reporting itself, the types, but also the representation in the reporters who are doing these stories from many localities all across the U.S. We've also, on this panel, we're trying to bring together some of our most exciting local news projects that we supported in the past that look at climate change and rising temperatures. But the session is also going to delve into stakeholder engagement strategies and K-12 education initiatives, which we're very strong on here at the Pulitzer Center. Just a couple housekeeping items. Just a reminder that if you're wanting to join in on the conversation online, you can use hashtag interconnected2022. And to please remember to wear your mask here in the conference when you're not eating or drinking for the safety of all of us. And with that, we'll get started. Our speakers will introduce themselves when they get up to present. But very briefly, we're going to hear from freelance journalist and Pulitzer grantee Melba Newsom, Chicago area educator and Pulitzer teaching fellow Jackson Potter, the president of Smart Power and executive leader Brian Keane, DC-based journalist and video producer Marcelo Jauregui-Volpe, and editorial director of the Mississippi River Basin Ag and Water Desk team, Tegan Wendland. And our moderator will be Cynthia Barnett. Cynthia is an award-winning environmental author and journalist who has reported on water and climate change around the world. Her latest book, The Sound of the Sea, Seashells and the Fate of the Oceans, was named one of the best science books of the year by NPR Science Friday, and one of the best nonfiction books of the year by Kirkus Reviews and the Tampa Bay Times and others. She's written for National Geographic, the New York Times, the Los Angeles Times, Wall Street Journal, Atlantic, and many others. She's an environmental journalist in residence at the University of Florida's College of Journalism and Communication in Gainesville, Florida, where she is currently overseeing a Pulitzer Center supported investigation with her students to look at the 50th anniversary of the Clean Water Act. Cynthia, we're very honored to have you here, and thank you for moderating our conversation.
Thanks very much, everyone. So we are just going to introduce ourselves to you and our projects for about 4 minutes each. And then we will, we really hope that you will ask us questions and that this turns into a conversation. So as you heard, I'm a longtime environmental journalist and author on the water beat, which is of course the climate beat, given that water is so severely affected by climate change. I've also done a lot of international reporting from the rural Maldives to West Africa and many of the places we have been talking about this morning. But at my sort of mid-career, I really felt a strong pull to work on climate change in my home state, which is Florida. That international context is crucial, but it's my sense that local journalism is the most important journalism for accountability, stories that move people, and its ability to build trust and solutions within community. So 6 years ago, I began teaching at the University of Florida College of Journalism and Communications with an emphasis on teaching hands-on through local and Florida stories. And we built our environmental journalism program around hands-on investigations from climate change in Florida's prisons, most of which are unair-conditioned, to the unequal impacts of and responses to hurricanes. So as just one example, in the wake of Irma in 2017, environmental journalism students uncovered major disparities in response times and in the quality and quantity of public support in their own college town. So Gainesville has among the steepest economic and racial divides of any college town in the nation. So that was a very local story, but also very much a climate justice story centered in racist historic settlement patterns. So these stories are published on our public media platform, which is WUFT, and also via the Florida Climate Reporting Network, a collaboration launched by Florida's major news organizations to stop competing on this existential crisis and start sharing. So in January, thanks to a Connected Coastlines grant, we launched this kind of investigation around Florida's water quality, spinning off the 50th anniversary of the Clean Water Act. And this was really deliberate because young people today are so devastated by climate change and climate inaction that they feel powerless and they feel they can't make a difference. So part of this is by rooting stories in the Clean Water Act and the extraordinary change that it brought in the United States a half century ago. We wanted to emphasize how change happens, that pressure on the powerful that Wei-Hu talked about this morning. So 50 years ago, the United States came together in this incredibly divided time to finally reach the understanding that sewage-filled bays, massive fish kills, and flaming rivers were not the inevitable costs of progress, but the avoidable consequences of weak or non-existent pollution control. So we made positive change then, as we have done so often in the course of human history, and young people and all of our audiences really need to understand that history. At the same time, like with those other projects I mentioned, it's problematic to cover climate change without connecting other harms such as pollution and racial disparities. So multi-million-dollar restoration efforts don't make sense if we don't also stop pollution flowing into these waterways and communities, for example. So today's panelists are doing some of the best work anywhere to make those kinds of connections and help people understand them. And I've been really inspired to get to know the work of these panelists, and I look forward to our conversation. Again, please be ready with your questions so that we can make this conversation relevant to all of you. I'm going to invite each panelist up to speak, and then I'll return here after we hear a little bit about their work. I'll return to ask some questions. I think we're going to start at the opposite end, if it's okay with you. Tegan, would you like to start? And then we'll just go in order until we finish. Thank you.
Well, hello. It is such a privilege to be here and just to have learned so much about your fantastic reporting over the past couple days. I'm based in New Orleans. I've spent the past decade covering coastal Louisiana and environmental issues there. It's arguably one of the most vulnerable places to climate impacts in America. So covering climate threats like storms, flooding, and sea level rise and land loss. We like to use football fields because people like football fields for some reason. So we're losing a football field of land on the coast every hour and a half, and that's because of many reasons, but largely because of engineering of the Mississippi River over the past 100 years or so, and how that's cut off the sediment flow of the river from rebuilding the coast, and then from the channels that oil and gas companies have built through the marshes over years, and those have deteriorated and just opened up into open water. So it's a very vulnerable place, and I've been covering that story for the past decade. We're looking for a lot of interesting solutions there. We built a giant wall around the city after Katrina, like a $14 billion wall that was funded by the federal government. So that is a storm surge barrier to protect us when big storms come in. But we didn't really think about the fact that we'd be having more rain and that we kind of created a big bowl. So now we're having a lot of flooding within the city. And so the reason I'm here is because I received a grant, a Connected Coastline grant with a colleague of mine from the Times-Picayune and the New Orleans Advocate. And we went to the Netherlands in 2019 to look at some of the solutions that they're experimenting with there. They've been engineering and coming up with creative solutions to flooding and using engineering solutions and working with nature to combat flooding there for over 1,000 years. They built maybe 40% of the country, I want to say, by using a polder system to build out levees and then fill them in with land. And so they built a lot of that country, so now they're forced to sort of find ways to protect it. And so we traveled all over the Netherlands and visited all of these really interesting engineering projects where they're doing things like the Zand motor, the sand motor, where they built a big pile of sand on the coast, and they designed it such that the natural currents would then wash that sand a mile or so to the east and kind of rebuild the area that has been lost. And so we did a collaborative series where there were a bunch of print stories, some radio interviews. I was with the NPR station at the time in New Orleans, so I did 4 or 5 radio pieces, and I also did some print pieces. So we did this big collaboration with all these different types of stories that were both on the NPR station, so reaching that audience, and in the newspaper, so reaching their somewhat broader audience. So that's kind of where I'm coming from. Now I'm trying to apply some of the lessons that we learned from that project to my new project. So I'm the editor of this big journalism collaboration based at the University of Missouri. It's called the Mississippi River Basin Ag and Water Desk. And we're covering the Mississippi River Basin from the headwaters up in Minnesota to the Delta, where I'm still based in New Orleans. And we have 10 reporters who are working with Report for America. And they're based at news outlets throughout the basin. And they range from small nonprofit investigative outlets to radio stations to big newspapers like the Star Tribune and the Milwaukee Journal-Sentinel. And we're going to be creating coverage of agriculture and water issues that is regional. We're looking for stories that help people make connections between the flooding and environmental and runoff issues throughout the basin, helping people to kind of conceive of the basin as a news region. And it's a pretty exciting idea because I think in the age of climate change, thinking of our news markets within state and city boundaries can be kind of limiting because floodwater doesn't really know state boundaries. And so we're hoping with this project to help audiences throughout the basin make those connections and then make informed decisions in their daily lives that are informed by that information. And then we're going to give all of those stories away for free. So we're building a distribution network that will give those stories to any outlet who wants to pick them up. So we're hoping that that'll really help us reach more rural audiences in particular that are disproportionately impacted by some of these things, but might live in news deserts where they don't have as much access to these types of impactful stories. So yeah, that's kind of what we're up to. Nice to meet you all.
Thank you so much. My name is Brian Keane, and I run a not-for-profit organization called Smart Power, based here in Washington, D.C. And quite frankly, our job is to help people make smart energy choices. So as you've probably seen for the past day or so, climate change is a big problem, and it often feels overwhelming. Our job is actually to help people realize that we can all be part of this climate solution, that each and every one of us can do simple, easy actions that actually have real solutions to climate. So really, for the past 10 years, 20 years, quite frankly, we've been working with Yale University, NYU, in very specific communities across the country and helping people make these solutions. So what we want to talk about today, what really I want to talk about today, is how that comes about. And let's put it a different way. Here in the United States, 80% of the American people say they want to buy solar power. That's pretty impressive. And yet, just 44% of the American people actually have solar power. So our job is to figure out why they're lying to us. How is it that we can actually get more people to buy solar power? And as one would do in the United States, it's like, oh great, let's put lots of TV ads, let's get people to buy solar because they see it on TV, and isn't that great? Well, and we did that. and that doesn't work. People in the United States won't buy solar because they saw TV ads. They actually won't buy solar because they saw it online. They won't buy it because they saw it in a newspaper, even your newspapers. They won't buy it because they heard it on the radio. Today in the US, people will buy solar because their friends and neighbors have solar, almost exclusively. In fact, and Cynthia, you're actually 64% more likely to buy solar because your next door neighbor has solar. And it is that local, it is that specific. And so our job is really to connect friends to friends, neighbor to neighbor, peer to peer, to get people to understand that it's okay to buy solar power because your next door neighbor has solar. It's okay to be part of the climate solution because every single one of us is part of that climate solution. And when we do, when we each take a small, simple energy action, we actually make big things happen and huge things happen. And I really want to talk about some of those huge things too. So that's really kind of what I want to talk about. And you can actually see it happening across the US. You can actually see the work that we've done in the US actually have huge impacts even around the world. We just finished a project in India that was pretty dramatic as well. So thank you for having me, and looking forward to having this conversation.
Hello, everyone. I'm Marcelo Jauregui-Volpe, and I live in DC and actually grew up in Arlington across the river, so I'm as local as you can be at this conference. And so I guess I did a story last summer with this organization called Hola Cultura, which is a nonprofit in DC. And essentially what we did is we wrote a story on the heat island effect, which is essentially this effect that happens in cities when concrete, sort of asphalt, these dark surfaces will essentially absorb the heat and make this ambient temperature warmer than in a leafier part of the city. And thanks to the Pulitzer Center, we had some funding to actually sort of make this kind of a multimedia project. And so we actually created heat maps and sort of did interviews throughout the city and people with the most effective areas. And thanks to those maps, we were sort of able to target sort of who were the most vulnerable and sort of who we wanted to interview. And I think it's sort of, for me, sort of stressed the importance of data reporting and how that's so important with journalism. And I think I have a quote here from a climate scientist, Jeremy Hoffman, who said that this sort of creating these heat maps are like a socially useful data set to talk about inequity through the lens of a climate stressor. So I feel like it was just a very clear way to show that, you know, climate change affects us all, but not in the same way. I think heat is a big example of that. And I think it's very important because I think it connects to so many different things. I mean, to start, if you think about redlining and gentrification and essentially how a city is built, like those decisions sort of are why we have heat islands. Why are there not a lot of green spaces in certain neighborhoods? And so, and the cool thing about this project is that it was sort of multi-generational. So I think our average age of our team was maybe like 22 or 23. So these were like high school students, college students. So young people, local, and you know, I think it was sort of a great project to be a part of. And now we're actually doing a podcast. We're sort of trying to enter the audio storytelling space and sort of expand this story. And yeah, I guess I sort of also wanted to just sort of end too just with a few thank yous, because I'm just a representative. As you know, I was part of a very big team. So I just wanted to thank Christine McDonald, who's the executive director of Hola Cultura, and then also Leul Bulcha, who was sort of he was the GIS person, because I have no data experience whatsoever. So he sort of helped sort of create those maps. And I guess heat is getting worse, climate change is getting worse, it's going to get hotter and hotter. This is going to be sort of an issue that's going to stick with us. Sort of the heat wave records in DC are just, in many other cities, are getting worse and worse. So I think this is sort of an important story. And I look forward to all of your questions and to these conversations. Thank you.
Hi, excuse me, I'm Melba Newsom, and I'm a freelance journalist based in Charlotte, North Carolina. And I want to talk just a little bit about my project, but also what led me here. This is my second grant-funded project from the Pulitzer Center, and the first was about the pandemic. I looked, I live in Charlotte, and they keep really granular data by race and ethnicity and all of that, because they were part of, that was mandated because of the Voting Rights Act, that you have to keep that data. And so they were one of the first places to document who was being impacted by the coronavirus early on, you know, by race and other demographic information like economics and things. And it became clear that it was impacting Black people very severely. So I proposed a story to Steve about the impact of the coronavirus on Charlotte's Black community. And it was a 6-part series, which I don't know what made me propose 6 parts. So I learned the next time, not that many parts. But it became so clear to me in every story that I reported that the people who were suffering the most from the pandemic were also the people who had the worst environmental conditions and who lived in the worst environmental conditions. That was true across the state. And Eastern North Carolina, I think a lot of people here are familiar with like the CAFOs, the industrial hog farming and poultry and everything like that, and the conditions there. The agricultural part of the state is also the poorest. It's also the most like polluted. It's the highest concentration of people of color, farm workers and all that. They really were suffering, and those were the worst numbers. And so it was just clear how interlinked these things were. And I think a lot of people realized that because it kind of jump-started the environmental justice movement again. But 2 years ago, we've kind of like fallen out of that space of talking about that. But this really put it on the front burner. And so I started a newsletter in that part of the state because it was also a news desert of, like, there's 6 counties in the state that have no newspaper, and 5 of them are in that area. So you get all your news from, you know, the Smithfield Bacon Republic or the Purdue Chicken, whatever, Bulletin. They kind of control the news in that area. So I started to report about that and what was going on because a lot of people were not familiar, even though they were so directly impacted. And my current project is about the impact of climate change on the people in the coastal communities. So primarily about the Gullah Geechee community, which is the area from Jacksonville, North Carolina to Jacksonville, Florida, and the descendants of West Africans who were brought here like 400 years ago. And they are threatened, they are like considered, are called the most climate threatened, some of the most climate threatened people in the world. And their land is just disappearing right there on the coast. And so, but the thing that makes it, there are certain things that come together in that part of the state and that part of the country that all work to the disadvantage of those people. First of all, poor. The science says that we're going to see increased flooding and storm activities, and the people in that southeast, in the southern part of the country, people of color mostly, will be mostly and disproportionately impacted. Also, there's stories that show this is where we were living, and we were forced to live, and so you have all of these competing, all these different factors that are working to the disadvantage. And people are really, the thing that's very interesting is people actually can, it's almost like a time-lapse movie. You can see climate change happening just from year to year. And so there are some innovative solutions going on, but it's also it was a big wake-up moment for a lot of people to realize that this isn't just something for the elites to be concerned about. If you make the people who are suffering and who are being impacted the most are poor people of color in those regions, and they are being driven out by climate change and development. So that's my story. Thank you.
Good morning. I'm Jackson Potter. I'm a high school history teacher, so I know I'm a little out of place. But it's good that I only have 4 minutes, because if you're like my students, you'd stop paying attention about after that anyway. And I'm rocking my Back of the Yard shirt, the community made famous by Upton Sinclair's book, The Jungle. And while it's changed, some of the industrial pollution and concentration of toxins has not. I ride my bike to work every day. It's only slightly less dangerous than much of the work you all have described over these last couple days. It's a virtual superhighway of 16-wheelers, you know, in a 1-mile radius. There's a tube factory, there's a pet food factory, there's, you know, an asphalt factory belching out fumes. There's all kinds of warehouses, Amazon and big box companies, just a ring around the school. And the school was built just a few years ago out of a metal shredding site that was contaminated. They decontaminated it, but students are still suffering from asthma. And the EPA has actually done a study, and students in my school community have, you know, 16 times the level of toxins in their immediate environment than neighboring communities in whiter, affluent areas down the street. And that, you know, also speaks to life expectancy. In Chicago alone, you'll see a 20-year delta from the rich white areas to Black and Latinx communities. And the Pulitzer Center has helped me allow students an opportunity to express agency around these and other issues. So we have all this stimulus money coming in, right? And it's going to the school district, going to the school. And so we created a dynamic budget spreadsheet that students could plug in our school numbers to determine how much money was supposed to come to them and their school community. And we're, you know, overwhelmingly low-income Latinx. All the data suggests, you know, COVID, as other speakers have mentioned, hit us harder. Poverty, you know, all of the health effects of living in, you know, this hub of pollution. And when students started thinking about what they wanted to do with that money and then advocating for it and speaking at board meetings and just talking to decision makers and tweeting at the mayor, you know, they clearly said they want organic, healthy food instead of, you know, the stuff they put in ovens and is, you know, really indistinguishable from like slop on a plate. They want their homes powered with solar, but, you know, their families can't afford it. So that needs to be subsidized. They want their schools solar powered. They want mental health supports in school clinics so that people can be healthy and get some of the problems that are being caused by the environment addressed. And the US Department of Energy suggests that schools spend about $8 billion on energy and emit 72 million metric tons of carbon, and that 95% of our school buses in this country are diesel, which, you know, is terrible in terms of contamination. So not only are they viewing this through kind of their local circumstance, but they also care deeply about, you know, international issues. So Pulitzer reporters have made them quite aware of mining issues in Africa, you know, the concerns around mineral extraction, South America and Asia, and they want to do something about these issues. So here are just a few things that I might ask of you as journalists to consider in working with us, young people in communities of color across the United States who want international solidarity and also want your support for the issues they're fighting for. We need more clarity around things like the COVID relief money, things like the infrastructure bill, things like clean, you know, jobs acts that are being passed in blue states. And how do we use that money to address these racial disparities? Can we solarize schools faster? Can we do renewable energy while simultaneously supporting vulnerable communities internationally? What, you know, the projects that Pulitzer's doing, how do we have intercambios with the Amazonian students to ensure that Chicago students are fighting for them and themselves simultaneously? And can you provide opportunities for youth of color, you know, to engage with teachers for common good bargaining? And, you know, we talk about labor solidarity. What could that look like in terms of contracts demanding environmental remediation? And where are the models we need to emulate? So hopefully you got some answers for those questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much for those inspirational introductions. I have some questions for our panelists, but as those of you in the audience have questions, please come up to the microphones and I'll keep my eye out. And if you speak into the microphone, the audience on Zoom will also be able to hear you, so that'll be important. I wanted to start with a quick follow-up question for Jackson. It was so neat to hear you talk about the high schoolers being involved in these issues. Are are all of them or some of them involved as journalists? Because I know the collapse of journalism in American high schools has been a really serious problem for both accountability and the pipeline into journalism.
To the extent that a tweet could be considered a form of journalism.
A tweet can be journalism.
Yeah. They've had some viral ones where they go hard at the CEO of the school district or the mayor and have gotten responses for members of the appointed school board in the city. They've, met with them in virtual meetings and gotten promises and commitments. They've spoke out at, the public board meeting that happens monthly. They've written pieces in the Pulitzer essay writing contests, but not full-form journalism. They have done political engagement activities where in the IB program they write a 2,000-page research paper about a local issue that has international implications, but not to my knowledge have any of those been published. But certainly if there's interest, I'd be happy to share them.
Does the high school have a newspaper or journalistic platform?
Yeah. No, that's a good point. It does. There have been environmental issues raised and issues around what to do with stimulus money, and our Student Voice Committee is active in terms of writing for that as well.
To the extent that anyone here could be involved in your local community's high school journalism programs, they are in crisis across the country, and they really need us. And to the extent that professionals can be involved, they can become more powerful. Marcelo, you mentioned that high school students were involved in your project. Could you tell us how you got them involved in the project and how they participated?
Yeah, so I actually was fortunate enough to do virtual school visits sort of after the project, and where I essentially got to present the project to different, age groups and just talk to them about their interest in journalism, but also their interest in climate change as well, and climate change activism. And so I guess I was really, optimistic after those kind of interactions. Just I wasn't that engaged when I was that age, so to see so many young people sort of aware of what's going on. I just remember there was one class I spoke with that they were doing activism around, there was a community garden that was closed in a senior housing complex in DC, and they were sort of organizing around that and trying to spread the word and seeing how we could collaborate to sort of, publicize what's going on there. So that leaves me hopeful that there's that engagement. I just hope now they need the tools sort of in the resources to sort of act on that, in that interest.
Right. Thank you. I see someone at the microphone. Hi, please introduce yourself and go ahead and ask your question.
Yes, thank you. My name is Wahyu from Indonesia. I just want to expand on that point. That was my question. You guys made a great projects and able to identify problems and offer solutions. But can you take us a little bit on the audience? How do you engage with your audience? How do you make sure that you reach to the right segment and get the right response from people who can make those changes that we expect to happen after reading or listening to your projects? Thank you.
Brian, do you want to tackle that one?
Well, I think so. So in a number of ways. So the way we kind of focus on our communities is we'll go into a state, and then we will actually, quite frankly, first we will reach out to communities specifically and say what communities are interested in becoming leaders in, for instance, solar energy in your state. So we will actually, if you would do an RFP, request for proposals for cities and towns, or even businesses, to say who wants to be a leader. Then from those, we will then approach those cities and towns first, and within those cities and towns, then start working through their communications channels. The important thing to keep in mind is that we are working through their organizations, through their leadership channels. What's really fascinating is that in the United States, there is no, as we say in solar, there's no Coke, there's no Pepsi, there's no brand name in solar. And since there is no brand name in solar, there's no one to trust. So we have to trust our friends and neighbors, or we trust the entities and organizations that we're already part of in order to give us that benefit of the doubt that we're doing the right thing. So we work through those organizations, through those entities, whether it's the city hall, the city council, whether it's our church, whether it's our place where we work, that will then say, oh, I guess this does make sense for me to buy solar. If my neighbor's doing it, if my boss says it makes sense, actually if the mayor, who I didn't even vote for, says it makes sense, maybe it does make sense. And you kind of work through those entities and organizations. And that trust, that sense of trust, we talked about this at the panel this morning, there was this discussion about you have to build trust in these partnerships. That sense of trust then actually says, okay, I can take the next step, and I can take the next step, and I can take the next step. From there, then they can start asking the questions like, how much does this actually cost? And who's actually going to do the work? How do you actually find a solar installer? And as we say, we take them by the hand and we walk them that last mile from awareness to installation. Because we know the awareness is huge. People just don't know how to do it. You don't walk into Walmart and buy solar. So we, in fact, bring the solar store to your home. That's kind of how you have to do this. And when people take one energy action, they then will take another one. And they'll take another one, and they'll take another one. Because then they realize, oh, this is actually pretty easy, and it actually has real benefits to my home and to my lifestyle on so many different levels.
Mm-hmm. That ethical change you talk about is so interesting. It's the same with native landscaping that I've studied over time. There's a tipping point when you get to a certain number of homes on a block, then everyone does it, but it takes getting to that tipping point.
That's exactly right.
I wanted to jump to talking about solutions, and I thought I would start with Tegan on this question, because you must cover one of the most devastating climate change stories in the United States, which is the loss of coastal Louisiana, and I couldn't believe that football field and a half statistic per hour, I think you said.
Football field every hour and a half. It's slowed down slightly, but it's about to speed back up as the sea levels rise.
Incredible. So given the devastation of that story, could you talk with us about how you do solutions journalism and report on solutions in that devastating context, and even infuse your stories with hope?
Yeah, I like that the gentleman who asked the question asked something about solutions as well, because I think we know from plenty of social science research that the problem-oriented narrative is not engaging our audiences very well. So solutions journalism has guided a lot of my work individually as a journalist over the past few years, covering the coast, and it certainly will, covering the Mississippi River Basin as well. And sometimes that means elevating big solutions and giving examples from other places, like the trip we took to the Netherlands, and detailing a bunch of different engineering and social solutions to big problems that are universal on coastlines. And sometimes it's elevating smaller community solutions. So for example, telling the story of a Houma Native American elder who was teaching young people the lost art of a basket weaving skill. And the Houma Native Americans along the Louisiana coast have largely left the coast over time. They were driven there by the Indian Removal Act and have lived there for decades off the land and water. But as the land disappears, they've moved north, and so it's sort of created this diaspora. And so a lot of cultural practices have been lost as a result. But there's this woman working to bring back this one particular craft. And that's just one tiny story. But those types of stories get a lot of positive engagement from audiences. They're very interested to see photos and video examples of this craft being taught, for example. And I think that it's inspiring because it shows humans' ability to adapt to extreme change and adversity. And I think we've adapted for thousands of years in the past, and it's a good opportunity to remind audiences that we'll continue to adapt in the future.
Melba, do you also want to weigh in on that question in terms of the Gullah Geechee or other people you cover? Is there a way to elevate their solutions and ideas and not always look at them as victims of climate change?
Yes. I do think that's very important to focus on, that these are people who are also offering solutions, not just victims. And I think that's one of the reasons that I wanted to go deeper into environmental reporting, because so many of the communities that are impacted gravely are communities of color, but so few of the environmental reporters are of color. And so it can feel like parachute reporting. You just come into this community only when there's some crisis. You don't, take time to get to know them, and you have to build that trust. And so that was one of the things that I wanted to do. I grew up in an area like in Arkansas that's very similar to Eastern North Carolina, and we had these same problems, but they weren't described as these problems. This was just life, where all of the worst stuff got dumped in our communities, right? And we kind of just like accepted it or whatever. And I think that I was surprised to find out that no matter, that it's famous across the world, the hog farming in North Carolina, the poultry farm. It is famous across the world, and some of the worst environmental racism you will see anywhere. But I was surprised that a lot of people still didn't realize, even though they lived there. Now, they didn't know some of them don't know what's going on. They smell it every day when they walk out, but don't understand, and they've been kind of lulled into this, this way of thinking, because people will come, they go, "What's that smell?" And they go, "Oh, that's the smell of money." That's the great line that Smithfield perpetrated, that this is prosperity. Well, they aren't the people prospering. And I think it helped a lot that I could say to them, I come from this place, and that, frankly, because I'm Black also, to talk to folks and they know I'm just not gonna come there, take their story, and run away and not do anything about it. But I think it is very important to show that the people who are impacted are also part of the solution. And I mentioned this the other day, I'll be doing some climate reporting in Africa, and the thing that incensed me is that that continent is so impacted by climate change, and they contribute so little to it. And so they will be climate refugees. But there was a big report that had the 1,000 most recognized or whatever climate scientists in the world. 5 were from Africa in the world, 5 out of 1,000, and 4 of those were white. And that just kind of, because there's a lot of great stuff going on there, on that continent, by people who live on that continent, and I think that needs to be recognized too, so that they're not just portrayed as victims.
Those are great points, and I have a quick follow-up for you about solutions, but I will say, just for the journalists here, for the US-based journalists who do reporting in Africa, I mean, one thing that seems important to me, I see many journalists start with the US scientists that are working on X in Africa, and I think the way to report from wherever you're reporting is to start with the scientists in that place, if it's a science story or what have you, and begin that way. But the follow-up question I wanted to ask you about solutions, in Eastern North Carolina, it seems that some of the big solutions being proposed and being acceptable to the government are being proposed by the same large agricultural companies you're talking about, some of the biofuels and so on. You've written a little bit about that, right? Could you talk about that context of the importance of credulity when reporting on solutions?
Well, they have the most lobbyists and the most money, so they get the ear of the government most. And generally when we hear something from Duke Energy or from Smithfield, it's kind of a big yawn, because it's been watered down so much. And I think but there are solutions by grassroots groups that are being proposed and listened to, because our governor is very interested and very concerned about climate change, so he brought in a bunch of local people. And I think the solutions and the first step in changing things in Eastern North Carolina, we hear people say that, 75% of people think climate change is a problem. I'm just throwing that figure out. But how many of them vote on that first? How many of them still vote for some jerk who says climate change is not real because it's not prioritized enough? And I do see activists pushing that to the front of concern to say, this is not just some esoteric thing, this matters to you, and getting to the policymakers and proposing solutions, and then letting people know that this little bit that you can do will make a difference, and kind of, because I think we have to push as much hope as we do fear, because it can be so overwhelming to think about this and to think, there's nothing I can do, so you just, sometimes like I do, just get in the fetal position and cry, but that's not very helpful. So I think there are a lot of good grassroots groups, and that is a big part of the solution, I think.
Okay. Yes, at the microphone. Go ahead, please introduce yourself.
Hi, I'm Emma Johnson. I was a reporting fellow last year. Tegan, I have a question for you about the network that you were talking about from Minnesota to Louisiana and reporting along the Mississippi. I was curious, like among the journalists that you have within this network, when you write stories that are covering environmental issues along the Mississippi, if you're trying to both take the local picture about what's happening in that place, but also scale back and take the big picture of the entire Mississippi, because you all are like working in this network, and how you sort of balance those two to talk about the entire system while also writing a local story.
Well, it's all philosophical, because I'm speaking to you at a weird time for our project. Our reporters just started on the 1st, so the majority of their time will be spent covering local stories for their local outlets, and then about a day a week, maybe 20% of their time is devoted to this more regional coverage. But we're kind of in constant conversation, and then we have regular weekly meetings. And so some of those local stories it'll become obvious that they are regional, that they're interrelated, whether that's, pollution from industrial facilities in towns that, have ports, or whether that's adaptation and mitigation funded through American recovery dollars. Like, there just are a lot of through lines that I think, I can guess as to what they are now, but they'll become more obvious once the reporters are on the ground and, reporting in their local communities. So I think it'll be a little bit organic. But I started by going on a tour of the lower basin, and I'm about to do the upper basin as well. I'm originally from a rural farming community in Wisconsin, an unincorporated village that's like 4 blocks big in the middle of nowhere. So I'll be going up to Wisconsin as well. So I've been on this tour meeting with our partners and meeting the journalists and the editors, but every place I've gone, I've also been meeting with advocates in those communities and hearing what the issues are there and trying to develop some of those relationships on the front end, so that those folks who are working on the ground on issues that are important to them in their communities can kind of tell us what they are, and also what news outlets they read, so that we can get our stories in front of audiences that will be most impacted by them.
Okay, thank you. Go ahead.
I'm Dan Grossman, as a freelance science journalist. And as a climate journalist and a homeowner who has installed solar, I've been gratified to see solar increasing in where I live, outside of Boston. But actually, I've also been very frustrated at how many roofs don't have solar. And so I'm going to make a comment and then a question. My comment is that it seems like when I talk to people, friends and relatives, about whether they're thinking about putting solar panels up, one of the primary things that come up is that they're worried about what's going to happen when they try to sell their house, because most people don't live in their house as long as the lifetime of a solar panel. And so I'd like to ask Brian to talk to the journalists here and in the Zoom community and tell us what you think we should be doing that would help people understand why solar would be good, apart from that it's good for the planet, why it makes sense for them.
Sure. Thank you. That's like the question. So much confusion about solar. You know, it's fascinating because solar, of course, has been on the marketplace really for 40 or 50 years, and today, these same questions just keep coming up. What the research is coming in now is that in fact solar on your home adds real value to your home for the resale. So it's a significant value. And what we're really seeing with solar today, by the way, is that new home buyers are actually looking at homes and asking for all the same creature comforts. They want granite countertops. They want and actually they want tankless hot water, and they want solar on their roof. So they're looking for everything. But by the same token, what we do know is that getting solar on your roof today is cheaper than in fact it's ever been. And what's happening is that you're seeing more and more people realizing that this actually, especially after the pandemic, is actually a key point for their ability to work at home, because now they're using more energy at home, and if they put solar on their home, it actually drops their cost. In fact, what we're seeing, and by the way, from our campaigns, we're able to see, in the US, we measure the cost of solar by the watt. So nationally, solar by the watt is about 30 cents per watt. When we are doing our campaigns, peer-to-peer, friend-to-friend, neighbor-to-neighbor, and you can scale these campaigns quite fast, so they're real. We've done over $100 million just in 3 years on these campaigns of installed solar. So nationally, it's 30 cents per watt. We do it for about 11 cents per watt, and we've actually done it for about 7 cents per watt in some states. The result being that the cost comes way down. So one thing to talk to your friends and neighbors about is that, in fact, not only does it help to resale, but today the cost is dramatically low. So the cost is cheaper. The solar we're getting today is much more efficient than it's ever been, and it'll last for 20 to 25 years. The payoff time, by the way, can be as low as 5 years and maybe even 7 years. 7 years is a long time at this point. The other piece that's really exciting is that still when you buy solar, it's not it's a big nut to crack. It's an expensive piece no matter what, even though the cost is coming down. But there are now solar loans that are available, whether from private companies or your bank or your credit union or your community bank. And those solar loans are by and large zero down loans where you're paying no money to get the solar. So it's zero down. And then what you pay every month, this debt service for that loan, plus what you pay to your utility bill, must be lower than what you are currently paying to your utility. It's like a no-brainer. So it is like, well, let's do this. Now then, and I'll stop soon, but the real kind of ultimate challenge that we have is that not every home can get solar. And in New England specifically, one of the biggest challenges we have is actually tree cover. And don't take your trees down. So, we need those trees. In the Southwest, we have a big problem with terracotta roofs. We have a big challenge with dust and sand. Quite frankly, I have a slate roof on half of my roof, and that's a real challenge. The other half we're able to put some solar on. But there's just some challenges where it's really you can't get solar on every roof in the country. That said, it's really exciting now with community solar, with utility scale solar that you can actually buy into. And so people can really be part of this solar solution. You can also really be part of a heat pump solution, and that in every home and every building, heat pumps are really becoming a way and are the way to reduce the cost of air conditioning and heating systems in the home. So really kind of exciting stuff to talk about.
Brian, I have a quick follow-up to Dan's question, and that is sometimes when journalists write about individual solutions to climate change, we get a lot of flack for the focus being on the individual when the change must be systematic. Is that a criticism you hear, and what is your answer to that?
So, it drives me nuts, quite frankly. Because, so, if just take it like this, you know, throughout the entire Obama administration, the focus was on climate legislation. Let's get climate legislation. And that was where all the focus was from all the environmental NGOs, and it never happened. Like, it never, ever happened. And here we are. Now, if the focus had been on an educational outreach for every person in this country to take some action, to do something, we would have been further along. And it's simply behavior change. We know we'd be much further along, because when you change behavior, you then, just by one little step, the human behavior will then take 2 and 3 and 4 more steps. So it's kind of like, yes, national legislative policy is extremely important, but it cannot be the only solution. We actually have to work on individual solutions, and then we scale them community by community, we scale them state by state, and we scale them business to business. What's really exciting today, if I can, is actually you are seeing corporate America, the Fortune 500, Fortune 1000, are actually now leading on what we call ESG, environmental and social governance, because it's actually now they're realizing, oh, climate change is affecting my bottom dollar. And so they now are stepping up, and they're saying, can you help us get our employees to get solar? So we're working through, you know, major corporations saying, yes, we can help your employees get solar the same way they get health insurance, right? And so it's like, wow, that's unbelievable. And they know they have their employees now working at home, and they needed to retain their employees. They need to get new employees. And so they say, hey, come work at my company. You get healthcare, you get vacation, and we have a great solar program too. And then they can brag that they're this great environmental and social governance company. And they are then actually doing that not just for the bragging rights, but actually for their ESG points as well. Mm-hmm. And it's really kind of remarkable how far mm-hmm. we've come on the corporate side. Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm. Okay. We have only about 10 minutes, so I think I'm going to ask all the panelists. You know, those of us who have been covering the environment for a long time, we feel so optimistic now because editors are finally excited about this story that was once the black sheep of the newsroom and so on. But I wanted to hear from the panelists what gaps are still out there. What, you know, is there a dream story, Jackson, that you wish journalists would be doing? Would there be a dream collaborative project if we had the funding to do it? If everyone could maybe take a moment and tell us what, you know, now that we've come this far, what needs to happen next? What's really important for local climate journalism and collaboration? And I'll start with you, Jackson, as the outsider who can give us advice.
Yeah, I mean, just even looking at my students, their families, and the ring of pollution that is just dominating their landscape, you know, it's useful to get models, like what are other cities doing to ensure that their diesel trucks and their school buses are becoming, you know, electrified or, you know, using better materials to lower their pollution footprint. You know, what are like other communities doing? I mean, even this panel is giving me ideas for ways and means to help inspire young people, teachers to collaborate, to, you know, fix these things through posting ordinances at the city council level or trying to ensure that the money already allocated is going to the right places.
Melba, what do you think? What gaps remain?
Well, there's a lot of great stuff happening with more, even people bringing on climate reporters and climate change reporters. I just saw one the other day, like the Macon Telegraph in Georgia.
I saw that.
Yes,
fantastic.
Yeah, so that's good. They're bringing on a climate change reporter. So that's a big change in thinking. I do think we still have to drill down harder to get people to see how this impacts them, because I don't think enough people understand that it impacts real lives every day, and to draw that connection, and that is not 30 years or 40 years, but it's happening right now. And I think we also, every time, I always say this, every time poor people need something, they say, oh, we don't have the money. Rich people need something, oh, they got tons of money. So I think we need to talk about the cost benefit, the cost of tackling this and the cost of doing nothing. This is costing us to do nothing. And, so we need to just make it really, really practical so that it does become one of those, our stories should involve that so people can say, okay, this is why this matters. More of that.
Great.
Yeah, I guess I would say I feel like there's still big gaps in local stories. And like I remember we interviewed someone in Ivy City in Ward 5 in DC, and she was a local politician and activist, and she was talking about this fight that she had to essentially, there's this closed down school called the Crummell School, and they wanted to turn that into a park, so like a green space, and essentially private developers were sort of competing over who was gonna build like unaffordable housing in that space. And just stories like that where I think like all the work is being done, there's like on a local level, but I feel like there's not enough coverage. And I just think, yeah, focusing on things that maybe aren't the most flashy but are super important, like budget meetings, like how is this money being spent? Like where is it going? The Department of Energy and Environment, like what are the actual, like, I remember for this story I had to go through documents that were, maybe it was a little mundane and boring, but it's like, that's like the change, like that's how decisions are being made. Like these dense documents are why, that we have the problems that we have today. So I was trying to fill those gaps and cover that stuff more.
Really good point. Brian?
So I would say and specific to the reporters here, the biggest story that is underreported or perhaps not reported at all is the creation of the virtual power plants. This is the biggest thing in energy that is happening right under our noses, and it is going to change the energy landscape in the United States or perhaps the world really within the next decade. And it is the concept and it's a reality that we have a confluence that is only available now for the first time. You have solar energy, rooftop, large-scale solar. You have battery power coming online at dramatic rates. You have electric vehicles, and then you have the blockchain, and you have the broadband. The result being that any homeowner now can now create power and store power, and more dramatically, share power. And that is happening today in the United States, that you have homes of 3, 4 homes, or 300 homes, or 30,000 homes, and they are sharing energy together without their utility, and in some cases through their utility. This is a virtual power plant, and it is entirely clean. And this is going to change the entire energy landscape, and literally within 10 years. This is why Biden is changing, just did the Defense Production Act on solar last week. This is why solar is such a big deal in the United States now, because we have solar battery, and virtual power plant is going to be the key words really for the next decade. And nobody's actually reporting on it, sorry.
Sounds like a microgrid.
Tegan, you had to be on the spot by starting, but now you get the last word.
Yay. So I'd say that, as all these new industries pop up around carbon sequestration and renewable energy, it's really important for us as journalists to continue interrogating these new solutions, how effective they'll be. Let's say carbon pipelines, for example. There's a lot of controversy over building pipelines to transport carbon and then sequester it deep underground. And it's our job to interrogate those solutions, but to do it in a productive way, so that we're not saying, oh, there's this new solution, but it's not actually a solution. Oh, you can get a electric car, but you won't be able to charge it anywhere. Those are important stories to tell, but how do we do it in a productive way that empowers people? And then I guess related to that, more news you can use, like tip sheets on how to flood-proof your home or build a microgrid with your neighbors. I think people are hungry for this, and I think as more individuals feel the personal impacts of climate change on their daily lives, whether that's increased heat or rain or flooding or whatever, they're going to be more interested in ways to come up with their own personal solutions for their households. And then more broadly, just diversifying our ranks in journalism, I think, will continue to be very important.
That's a good point, and it also kind of ties things together nicely. We began with a dearth of journalism in high schools, and we're kind of ending with that statement that there haven't been enough journalists of color covering the environment, and that is a loop, again, that we can all work on, and that I know the Pulitzer Center works on as well. So thank you to the panelists, and I think Steve is going to come up and give us some instructions for what's next.
Thank you so much, Cynthia. Thank you, panel, to our panel. Great job. Way to end it on a positive note there with those last comments. That was excellent. No, well done. So yeah, this concludes this panel, and I want to thank everyone for coming. In terms of lunch, coming up, there's lunch boxes are outside, and yeah. Oh, and sorry, and Gustavo's going to make a quick announcement. Sorry.
So, I will ask you to stay, those who want to stay or not really starving, for 10 minutes more, because we'll do a group picture and also do our call for action for the investigation of the disappearance of Don Philip.